Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the next episode of our series In Pursuit of Knowledge here at the University of Melbourne. My name's John Faine. I'm your moderator for this evening. I'll introduce the panel in just a moment. Before I even acknowledge country, it's typical at these events to ask you to turn your phone off. But we don't want you to, but we do want to make sure that your phone is on silent. And for reasons I'm about to explain, you will want your phone because it's through your phone that we will get your questions. So could you do us the courtesy of making sure we're not interrupted by your exotic ringtone, a dog barking, or they eat dogs and cats, of course, but if you could please make sure. The University of Melbourne acknowledges the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we work, learn and live. The Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples from Burnley, Fisherman's Bend and Parkville, South Bank and Werribee campuses, the Yorta Yorta Nation for the Dookie and Shepparton campuses, and the Dja Dja Wurrung people for the Creswick campus of the university. And we also acknowledge and we're grateful to the traditional owners, elders and knowledge holders of all Indigenous nations and clans who've been instrumental in our reconciliation journey. And we recognise the unique place held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the original owners and custodians of the lands and waterways across this Australian continent, with histories of continuous connection dating back more than 60,000 years. We also acknowledge their enduring cultural practices of caring for country. And we pay respect to elders past, present and future. We acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge within this academy. As a community of researchers, teachers, professional staff and students, we are privileged to work and learn every day with our Indigenous colleagues and partners. And in making this acknowledgement of country, we commit to respectful and responsible conduct towards all others according to the traditional laws of this land, particularly at times of formal ceremony. Now, this series has been created to draw on the expertise of the community of scholars that is this university and to address even the most difficult of questions. The thinking is that there ought be nothing too difficult or too complex for us to respectfully engage and respectfully agree and disagree and explore and amplify the great questions of our time. We've already conducted several of these, and tonight we're talking about multiculturalism and the vital role it plays in creating the harmony, the prosperity, the livability of this and other cities around this country. But it's not without its problems, and particularly since the crisis in the Middle East, some fractures have started to open, and it's of deep concern to us that we need to make sure these aren't permanent or lasting. So whether the conflict in the Middle East finishes in a day, wouldn't that be good? A week, a month, even a year, whenever it happens at some point, we need to ask, what is it that we need to do as a community in order to recover the cross-cultural, interfaith and other dialogues that were such a wonderful feature of multiculturalism in this city and around Australia. Even within the university, we've seen some of those tensions. It's of notorious public knowledge. And hopefully, an event like this and others in this series bring us together where we can explore some of these themes and respectfully engage on them. The university has a social contract. It has an obligation, in my view, to amplify its knowledge, not to keep it locked up within the confines of the university. So here we are. Now, multiculturalism, we have so many experts we could have chosen to speak tonight, and we're very much pleased that the three we have will join us. The format is very straightforward. Each of our three experts will speak, and for a short period of time. We've asked them, could you speak for half an hour? To which they say, yes, we could. And say, good, well, could you do it in 10 minutes? Well, that's difficult. Great, because you've only got 5. And the reason for that is because we want this to be conversational. We don't want PowerPoints, overheads, speeches, monologues. We want dialogue. We want it to be conversational. So each of the three will speak for 5 minutes. I'll ask them some questions, and then we move through all of our three speakers. And the order is Karen Farquharson first, and Jola Bianco on my right second, and Ghassan Haj third. Now, I'm not going to read out their distinguished credentials. Some of it's on the screen, and it's all available through the university's Find an Experts page. And they're all, each of them, leaders in their field. When they've each spoken for their introductory and initial contributions, I'll engage with them for a while, and then we'll open it up to you, and you get to ask the questions. The questions are moderated. They have to be, to avoid anything that might be hate speech or inciting violence or defamation, but that's all. We're weeding things out. So you're wasting your time if you thought you'd put something that's going to incite hatred, violence, hate speech, any of those things. That won't get through. But your questions, using that QR code, your questions will come to the screen and you will see the questions. And we're using some simple technology, it's called Slido. You get to vote on the QR code, as well as asking a question. You can also endorse someone else's already asked question, and you can promote it up the order. So if everyone in the room wants question number 5 or 3 asked, up it goes, it becomes the first one on the screen, and it gets asked. So you are in charge, and I'm in your hands. Very simple. Everybody knows. Someone's got a little bit of an echo going there. We'll sort that out straight away, and then we'll get into it. Now, our first expert this evening is Karen Farquharson. Could you make her very welcome, please?
Thanks, John. And thanks, everyone. And before I get started, I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting here on the land of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. This land has never been ceded, and I pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room today. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So much you could say about multiculturalism. I guess I'll say just a couple things. Australia is a society that was founded in racism, and this is not controversial. Maybe calling it racism it was founded in racialism. When British settlers turned Australia into a nation, there were sort of two different types of racism that structured Australian society. The first was anti-Indigenous racism, which was administered quite separately to the anti-migrant racism, which was administered through the White Australia policy, which is one of the first laws passed by the first Australian Parliament in 1901, the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901. Which restricted Australia under an ideology of white supremacy. Basically, Australia was designed to be a white nation for white people. And that meant that everyone who was allowed to come here would have to be white. Obviously, this was eroded after World War II, when people who weren't considered white were allowed in under the kind of populate or perish imperative, which was also a racist imperative in response to the perceived fear of encroachment from Asia. And still, even then, it was still a society organized under an ideology of white supremacy. The people who were coming in were still people who were thought to be able to become white over time, and were people who looked white and were thought to be able to assimilate. So assimilation was the goal with the post-war migration. Of course, that didn't happen. People didn't assimilate. There was a lot of external pressure on Australia to stop being racist. And in the 1970s, there was a shift from being organized around this ideology of cultural homogeneity to being organized officially around multiculturalism. And multiculturalism is today a demographic fact of Australian society. We are a multicultural society. We're also a multiracial society, a multi-ethnic society. But the idea of the kind of promise of a multicultural Australia, I'd say, has been very much eroded, and it's been being eroded since probably the whole time, but really explicitly since the late 1990s, when one of my sociology colleagues, Scott Pointing, and his colleagues have called the new integrationism, which is kind of like a return to assimilationism under a guise of multiculturalism. So you can come here and you can have your culture, but you need to also be one of us. You need to be one of the community. Racism, I would say, continues to structure Australian society. I do research in two main areas. One of the areas I do research in is on the place of African people, Black African migrants in Australian society. And that research has found that Black African migrants experience a lot of challenges and a lot of racism in their experiences here. They just go about their lives walking down the street together, and they're called a gang. They experience discrimination in the labor market. They experience all kinds of discrimination. The other area that I do research in is community sport. And my research in that area has found that racism is a really strong feature of children's sport. So for me, the kind of idea of a multicultural society where everyone is, getting on really well with each other, respecting each other, is an absolute myth, because these things are happening every day, every week around Australia. And I think that we are lacking a vision for what a successful multicultural society should look like going forward. I feel like there were strong visions in the past. There was a strong vision of a cultural homogeneous society. There's a strong vision of a multicultural society, but that became eroded with this kind of new integrationism and a return to assimilationism. How do we become a cohesive society going forward? How do we become a place where people from all backgrounds, all faiths, can live lives without being harassed for their identity? I don't really have any answer to that. But I think that that's what we should be aiming for and what we should be looking to do.
Okay, so where does the leadership come from? Do we look to government and expect government to solve this problem, or is it something that we need to address in another way? Is it top down or is it bottom up?
I think it probably needs to be both, but I do think there needs to be really strong political leadership. At the moment, we hear about caps on international students and too many migrants and not enough houses. And what is the vision? Why are we bringing all these migrants in? What is society? What do we want to look like? Where is the agency there? I feel like there needs to be a lot of conversation around that, and actually some bold vision being put forward. And I think that it does need to come from politics.
But politicians tend to only do what's best for them rather than what's best for the nation. They do what is likely to get them re-elected or to entrench their power. If they think this is a too hard basket, too difficult question, they're not going to promote it, are they?
So how do we get politicians to start looking at this as a serious election issue? I think that's a grassroots thing, it's part of it. But I also think that sometimes you need to be brave as a politician. And this is one of those areas where it really is the future of the nation that we're talking about. This country's always had a short election cycle. That's not a new thing. And yet, in previous eras, there were the possibilities of visionary changes. How do we foster that, I guess, is the question.
Is it utopian to think it'll disappear as an issue anytime in the foreseeable future?
It is utopian to think it will disappear as an issue anytime in the foreseeable future. It hasn't disappeared yet. I think racism still continues to structure this society, and the way the society is set up is maintaining the current racial hierarchy. So it's not going to go away.
As we speak, there are people standing trial for doing Nazi salutes. We're in a city where not long ago people were parading in black uniforms doing Nazi salutes in the city of Melbourne, and the police provided them with an escort so that they weren't in any way interrupted. That shocked many people, me included. I never thought I would see something like that. What do we learn from the fact that, first of all, that happened, and secondly, it was, in many people's eyes, an expression of free speech and the right to assemble?
At the moment, we're seeing racism coming out of the closet. So I don't think it ever went away. I think it's always been kind of bubbling around. But with the global impact of Trumpian politics, populist politics, I think that people who are expressing these views are feeling a lot more comfortable being really open about it than they have in previous times, at least in my lifetime. And it is shocking that such overt racism is happening. And I think that it's a symptom of broader societal problems. But yeah, I don't have a solution for you.
Each of our experts, and I'll start with you because you're first, Karen, you do work on racism beyond Australia, around the world. We're not the only community, the only society grappling with these issues. Are there examples that we can learn from? Are there initiatives? Is there progress being made in other communities, in other societies, in other countries that we should be learning from and adopting here? Maybe the resurgence of racism is a response to things getting better. Maybe it's a reaction when the power dynamics of racialized society start to change, that there's a backlash against that. When Barack Obama became president, that was a massive shift in American society, and I would say that the election of someone who was fostering populist politics straight after that was a reaction to the progress that was made to enable an African-American man to become president. So I think that there has been progress made, but I think that this current situation is a resurgence of racist discourses that have been kind of long underground and unpopular. I think that in Australia it's really taboo to talk about race and racism as well, and so it's hard to have a conversation here about, a frank conversation about what racism looks like here. Do you think so? We've been talking about it since Pauline Hanson popped up on the scene. Have we though? Have we been talking about racism, or have we been talking about Pauline Hanson? I think we talk about it in coded secret ways. We don't actually come out and say this is really racist, problematic. I think it's actually quite, I think there's all kinds of taboos here around it. Oh, that's not racism. Adam Goods, that's not racism. We just didn't like him, when clearly, it was racist. So I think it's one of those areas that is quite challenging to talk about. All right, and just finally, before we move on to Joe, are there particular initiatives that you've seen in your academic work, whether it's in Canada or whether it's in Germany or wherever it might be, that you think we could and should learn from? So the evidence base for effective anti-racism is really poor. There's actually not that much research on what is effective in tackling racism. There are a lot of things that are implemented that look like they're tackling racism. I'll give you like diversity training that have really mixed and relatively poor evidence base. So I think probably what we need to do is actually be a bit more explicit in trying to actively tackle racism and develop that evidence base. Things like affirmative action actually are effective. And again, a huge backlash against affirmative action. But actually it works. Quotas work. Those things can be effective. Structural interventions can be effective, but there has to be a political will to implement them. We also have an added challenge in Australia where we don't measure racism against anyone except for Indigenous peoples. So it's actually really hard to tell. We have attitudinal surveys. We have people who say they describe their experiences of racism, but
but it's not any nuance to it. So I think that there's work to be done in actually trying to think about how we tackle racism here without reifying racial categories, which are rubbish categories. Because of course, race is a social construction. There's no biological reality to racialized categories. They are rubbish. So how do you tackle racism without race?
Okay, lots to think about. Karen, thank you for getting the ball rolling. Joe, your time starts
Thank
now.
you. Thank you very much. I think I should start off by saying that I don't think of multiculturalism as a kind of completed story or an achieved state, but a kind of project for managing the fact that Australia has, through the various processes we've heard of, recruited itself and found itself to be a deeply diverse society and never imagined or desired to be those things. And I, as an educator and a linguist, I pay a lot of attention to how we communicate, and I think of some decisive moments in our political history, and one of them is 1948, and Arthur Cordial, who's the Minister for Immigration at the time, who basically says that it's not possible to recruit the new population that the government had decided the nation needed without an investment in the teaching of English. And I think this seems like a pragmatic and perhaps slightly uninteresting story to some people, and I find that's very regrettable because I think that people have a very reductive, narrow and simplistic view of the importance of language, and I find it to be central. It's so important, it actually happens under our noses and we take it all for granted. I feel that that investment from 1948 has produced more mobility in Australian society for certain groups of new arrivals than exists in the United States, for example. But it has deeper ideological and cultural effects, which are to empower, I don't particularly like that term, but to empower people to participate in first person, in debates and arguments in the society. And I don't think that that's something that should be undervalued or underestimated. So I do genuinely think that we underappreciate the importance of public investment and pragmatic policy, and I think that a lot of policy in Australia is characterised by non-ideological or not overtly ideological pragmatism, and I think that's a good thing. I think we should be able to argue about everything that we want to argue about, but ask yourself, how is it possible for people in first person, I don't mean through representatives, to speak for themselves, their issues, the controversies that they might provoke by saying the things that matter to them in society without the means for being confident in their language in written and spoken form. And a lot of people, when they hear this message, they think of language in a very functional way, but it's deeply tied to a sense of identity and belonging and the symbolism. And then we've tied that to, I think, what is unquestionably, and I've looked at this in great detail, unquestionably one of the three top most responsive societal programs in the world in relation to multilingualism. And yet we are a continent in which there is enormous effort by Indigenous people to recover their languages, to rebuild their societies, to rebuild their sense of identity. And the great majority of the population knows nothing about this. So we have a kind of non-communicating components of our society, and a large part of it is because of the way we don't speak to each other. So I think I like to put some emphasis on pragmatic questions because I think you build deeper senses through that process. I also feel like it's very important not to speak of multiculturalism and to judge it in terms of some completed ideology. It's actually a contested idea. It should continually be revised and critiqued. I don't expect political leadership on this area. I don't think that our politicians have thought about this for about 30 years in a substantive way. And that's because I think we have a fundamental flaw in our political democracy, which is that we are effectively a vote-centric system, and I believe in a more discourse and voice-centred system of decision-making. So I would like to see us point to a kind of multiculturalism which looks at, and this is deeply connected to the voice referendum last year and its sad failure, to something which is much more devolved in our societies. I would like to place some emphasis on forms of deliberation and identity in smaller units in our society, which also still build cohesion. So I just want to finish, because I know you're looking at me, even though I'm not looking at you. I think it's important to imagine that we are some kind, this is a simplification of course, a combination of a vertical set of structures in Australia in which we all ought to want to be the same. You know, our rights as citizens should be absolutely equal, and there should be no way in which any of those is impugned through the racism that exists and the forms of economic and political disadvantage that exist, in which there's this vertical kind of equality, and then horizontal immense diversity, which goes beyond ethnic and racial difference to all the ways in which people differentiate themselves and imagine themselves, so the multiple kinds of citizenship, participation and identities. And these are both, this is a dynamic and turbulent mixture, and I don't think we can ever imagine or even desire realistically a society where there's no conflict, because it's I don't mean conflict as in open fighting. I tend to work in Southeast Asia. That's been in conflict mitigation and peace building. That's what I've been doing for the last 15 and 20 years. And your question before about, is there a society to learn from? No, if you imagine that there's a place that has achieved a settled state of nirvanic social life. There's social turmoil everywhere. The exclusion of different kinds of people for different kinds of reason is a universal, unfortunately, universal human reality. And I work in facilitated dialogue group resolution of these problems, and they need to be redone continually. So I don't think of this as anything that's permanently solved, but a dynamic, ongoing process. And I find that our public education systems do not commit enough to this, to forms of dialogue and understanding. Our governmental leadership is really very bereft of ideas and commitment and solidarity with people who suffer a lot in this area. And our population is not significantly involved in these discussions, because we relegate to the margins the things that I think are very important, which is, how do we cohere as a society through our communicative practice? I think that that's not the only thing that goes on, because the material opportunity is very important, and more people in Australia are becoming poor. And the things that produce conflict in society most readily is a coincidence between intergenerational material progress, that is poverty and lack of opportunity and economic growth, and particular racial, ethnic or other kinds of categories of identity. When you get a combination of those things together and people start to see hopelessness in the future for their children, you have built in significant conflict. And in two of the societies I work in, it's precisely that coincidence that has produced really bloody civil wars. So, Australia lacks that, of course, but I think we have to be continually focused on this, because we are building forms of intergenerational inequality, which I think have been ameliorated through public policy for a long time.
So is there a coincidence between inequality and racism?
Yes, there is. There is at the well, there's
not unique just to Australia. Are you saying this is across the board?
Well, the racism takes multiple forms. There are forms of racialised identifications in all societies. I think we tend to see it in one particular way in our experience, but I encounter this in many parts of the world, and it's experienced as racial exclusion in multiple societies. And many societies have forms of institutionalised preference for some groups that doesn't exist in law in Australia. We don't have preferential banking systems for some groups, but that does happen, and student preferences. But so these do exist in other societies. So I don't think that that's something we want to inherit or import. But the segmentation that is there in relation to opportunity for some groups is really clear. I think that's undeniable.
Older people tend to be more prejudiced, I'm not going to say racist, tend to be more prejudiced and fixed in their ways than young people. So is it just a matter that we're too impatient? If we just wait long enough and there's more funerals, then we'll have less racism and a stronger multiculturalism?
No, I think it's too much of an active project of... I think it's an obligation on our education systems to deal with human differences, to deal with the capacity of students, young people to disagree agreeably, to disagree productively. I don't think we teach enough about disagreement. I used to have to teach that in courses that I taught at this university when I was still employed here, because I found that too many students who came to the system, when we were dealing with controversial subjects, personalised things a great deal and made other students feel very bad. And this was because they had no actual experience themselves. They were either themselves the victims of some of these problems, and so things were very real and raw to them, or they were people who felt themselves attacked as privileged individuals. And so I used to have to devote time to these things, and I think that it's in a diverse, pluralistic and unequal society, and we are less unequal than other places, but the levels of inequality are significant and growing. We have to invest in the practices of building communication that is also a form of resilience, and we don't do any of that anymore.
Are you able to point to examples where you can train people effectively to be permanently not racist? In other words, you can teach people to leave that behind.
I wouldn't aim for permanently not racist. What I would aim for is for a critical scrutiny of how differences work. Obviously anti-racist, no one should tolerate racism of any kind, but a critical scrutiny of, because multiple differences in society are the target of forms of prejudice at different times. And we have to be aware that identification is a really important human process. Forms of identification themselves proliferate. There are forms of debate and liberation and claims for liberation, emancipation in our societies that were not even present in public debate 30 years ago. So, no one would have predicted that the whole movement around LGBTIQ rights would have been a question of major moment in our societies, but they have been. And I think we tackled them in a way that imagined and produced quite a lot of progress. There's, I think, if you look through a long span of history, you'll see that different tasks have been placed on the emancipation agenda at different times in history, and some societies have tackled them relatively well and others have not, and I think that they actually never go away, perhaps, but certainly they're manifested in different ways. But there's also progress. It's impossible to deny that there's forms of progress. I think that it would be just too negative to deny that, and lacking in hope. And I think we need to give young people, I think a lot about schools and young people. I think there's nothing worse that for young people to have a sense of hopelessness. I think that's very damaging to them and to the prospects of a future. So it's not a question of hoping that certain groups of people die off, because these things are not embodied in physical, they're ideas and ideologies that we carry that actually are dynamic. They change their nature over time. And I just think it's only in forms of open discourse and contestation in which we respectively disagree with each other. That's what we have to teach, the ability for people to disagree with each other well.
Needless to say, it was a provocative question, but I got what I wanted, so thank you very much, and we'll come back to some of those themes. Ghassan, you're our third speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Lost my train of thought here listening to Joe. And yeah. Well, I find it actually genuinely very hard to speak about this, because I have a certain awareness of the multiplicity of meanings that the word multiculturalism takes in everybody's imagination. So we imagine ourselves sitting talking about multiculturalism, but I'm not confident that when I say multiculturalism, there is that much of a an agreement about what is it that we are talking about. But so I just want to start that right from the early days, there were lots of versions of multiculturalism, and that stay with us. There's a long tradition of white Australian desire to help migrants well before multiculturalism. If you go in the country, countryside, etc., where immigrants in the 1930s and 40s arrived, they have plenty of stories of white Australians helping them to settle, etc. But the interesting thing is that these stories of settlement, nice settlement, always get to a point where they say, but when we started feeling autonomous, they weren't very happy with that. When we felt that we didn't need the help, we just needed to have a nice neighborly relation, not them helping us or something like this. It didn't translate always. So there is this structure of a desire to help, but keeping the person who is helped in the position of always needing to be helped. And this structure has replicated itself in multiculturalism. There is a kind of like a way of living multiculturalism in which people say, like the sentence that was used, which I don't remember it word for word, but the sentence used for this talk, which was the idea that multiculturalism was a success story. And I know a lot of immigrants that I worked with who think multiculturalism was a success story. But what they think is multiculturalism was successful because we struggled so hard. It's a long history of us struggling against whites, etc., etc. So they have a story of the success built on them struggling, and multiculturalism is the outcome of that struggle. On the other hand, you have still a very white imaginary of multiculturalism, which is multiculturalism is a success story, i.e. we white people are amazing. We brought all these different people and still managed to create a society. And here's the imagination is that the white person is sitting there and all these different, a bit like John supervising the three of us here at the moment, kind of like, sort of like, and so this replication of a structure of the white manager sitting and sort of like dealing with woggy types and sort of like, and the outcome is nice at the end. So there's this conflict. There's another conflict which I remember was very, very pronounced at the times when I was sort of like beginning to be active, which is the fact that multiculturalism is not good for nasty racism. Multiculturalism is okay for soft racism. Nasty racism is the kind of racism that white people meet and all of us, non-indigenous people, meet on indigenous people. That's really nasty racism. The racism that sort of like immigrants have coped with, I mean, they have horrible stories, right? But it's not seen as with the same cruelty or the same sort of like, well, it wasn't genocidal, these kind of things. So, and there was a sense that multiculturalism dealt with this bit of kind of like Yeah, soft racism. Colonial racism is a completely different question. And that was also partly built on the idea that multiculturalism did not really deal, at the time when multiculturalism was created, with colored communities as such, like Greek, Italian, Lebanese, even Chinese, Vietnamese, but sort of like it was later when Indian and Africans started coming that things became much more complicated in terms of what is the relation between colonial racism, racism towards black, and racism towards migrants. And so there's this complicated story again. Now, and
1 more minute.
yeah, okay. So what I want to say is that there's a difficulty in thinking some spaces of multiculturalism which are totally void of multiculturalism. For instance, foreign policy. How multicultural foreign policy is. Should foreign policy be multicultural? I come from Lebanon, having 20 groups with 20 different foreign policies is not amusing. So it's not something I really advocate or something, but at the same time, it raises a difficult question. So I want to finish, I squeezed the minute a little bit, but I want to finish by saying that my feeling has always been that at the end of the road, there is a multiculturalism which dignifies people, and there is a multiculturalism which humiliates people. And what is the difference between the two is very, very complex. I'm happy to talk about it. But you can actually have a foreign policy which does not please the Arabs without having to humiliate Arabs. You can have not just talking about foreign policy, but I have to say we have a knack, some sense of complicity with humiliation, which I don't know how we manage it, but it really bothers me because the most negative force in history, I believe, genuinely, is the sense of being humiliated and resentment. Historically, across the board, we managed to bring and accept refugees into Australia while humiliating them. We don't have this idea of saying, welcome to this country, but hey, thank you for coming. The idea of thank you for coming, the saying to refugees, is so absent out of our imaginary and so we become a humiliation-making machine, which has really detrimental effects. Sorry.
We've got used to the concept of performative politics, and we see it all the time. Are you saying we have performative multiculturalism? We do it so it looks good without really sincerely believing in what it means?
Well, no, I'm not saying that at all, because I don't think there is a single meaning of what multiculturalism means. And I wouldn't want to be, as an anthropologist, someone who comes and says, let me tell you what multiculturalism really means. I just accept the fact that it means so many different things for people. But there's a lot of multiculturalism that I find very pleasing, where people don't know that they are being multicultural. You go to a football match, and parents are kind of like sitting and from all kind of like walks of life, and having a chat, and you say, if you land in the middle of them, say, wow, what a wonderful example of multiculturalism. They go, piss off, mate. Sort of like what you're talking about. This is not,
For a start, you've got to decide which code of football you're talking about, don't you?
Well, yeah.
Yeah,
I live between Sydney and Melbourne, so I have a good array of
And of course, most people think what we call soccer is real football, so let's not even start that one. Although, in fact, let's pursue that, because sport is exactly, I was talking to Karen about this before, what are some things that work? And Ghassan, sport is one of the things where a lot of what otherwise might be regarded as boundaries just seem to vanish and disappear. So is that something where we should be saying, well, investing in cross-cultural ties through sport have benefits way beyond just the field where the game is being played?
I think I agree with what Joe says. Wittgenstein differentiate between things that happen according to the rule and things that happen as a rule. So for instance, you can say the rule is that the train to Geelong leaves at 6 p.m., but the guy at the station will tell you, as a rule, the train leaves at 6:5. And the idea of as a rule means it is how we live it. And multiculturalism is not something that works well when it is the rule. It is something you have to create so that it is, as a rule, how do we live with each other to not humiliate each other, to be aware that we can have sort of like strong differences without this going overboard to humiliation.
So one of my pet gripes is when people, and so far Joe's the only one who's done it, use the word tolerate. As someone who's Jewish, I don't want people saying, oh, we're very tolerant of the Jewish community, or we're very tolerant of the African community. That means, look, we don't really like you, but we'll put up with you. Barely. So how did this word tolerance get into the language, and what do you think it means when we talk about tolerance? Do people really understand what they're saying?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've written extensively on tolerance, massively, in fact, chapters on the structure of tolerance and the fact that tolerance is always a power imaginary, because you don't tell someone who has the power not to tolerate, and when the moment you ask someone to tolerate, you are actually confirming their power not to tolerate. But I'm glad you raised this. I'm glad I've written so much about this, as I said, but here we are. It's been pre-used politically, sort of like my book, White Nation, which has on tolerance endlessly, sort of like is 25 years old now. I feel people keep telling me it's been republished and it's being taught everywhere, but I don't feel we need to talk about multiculturalism while admitting how defeated all of us who had grand ideals and was struggling for them, how defeated we are. Because if we don't agree that we have been defeated and what are the forces that defeated us, we cannot just keep formulating policy once more.
Well, I don't want to be as pessimistic as that, and progress may not happen quickly or within a defined framework of time. I'd hate you to think your work was useless, Ghassan. I hate anyone in the academy to think their work was useless. It might not bear fruit straight away, but Joe, you've picked up on language and you talked about language, so talk to me about the word tolerance. Why has it survived? Why has it persisted in the discourse, in the discussions about multiculturalism when it's a most unsuitable word to celebrate?
That's interesting. I wasn't aware of using the word, maybe I did, but I remember hearing the Secretary General of UNESCO once, who at that time was a Spaniard, talking about the incredible power of the word tolerance. I think we have to accept that there it has connotations that are different for different people in different contexts. But generally, I agree with Hassan's point about this. I think it is in the specific Australian instantiation of the use of that term, it does have that vertical sense of that he noted of putting up with difference rather than something more substantive. And that's what I was trying to push to. I think that the next phase of development of multicultural ideology or thinking in Australia has got to be to explore a practice that integrates with a new kind of democratic discourse, which is a new way of making decisions, which has got to be much more discursive. I mean, and one of the things we have to talk about is what we share together as a society. In fact, I think that's the most important thing to talk about. What's common, and I describe that as vertical. What I mean is the institutions that we live in, maybe vertical is not the right terminology, but I do feel that it's one way of characterising this, and it is that we should talk about more in processes that are then tied to actual decision-making in some way, and that involves some reform of our polity. I just don't feel that the way our society is structured is going to be able to tolerate, here's the society, not individuals in it, it's going to be tolerate the pressures from immense globalisation that are now unstoppable, and even the process of deglobalisation, which is a reaction against forms of globalisation that's gone too far, and partly because of the bringing back of home of sovereign rights, which is actually a reaction against the good things that opening up to internationalism has produced. So I think we are in an historically important moment in which it's possible to reimagine how our society works in deep ways. Now, there are some societies that are experimenting quite well with forms of devolved decision-making. I'm not imagining that, we undo our society. I'm not even aspiring to anything like that. I just feel like the kinds of pressures that we face are pressures in which it's important to have discussion at a level that allows people to make concrete decisions that affect the communities that they live in more substantially than exists at the moment.
Karen, we've had Prime Ministers who thought the most important symbol of connection to Australia was that you knew the average that Don Bradman scored in his cricket career. How do we broaden the concept of what it means to embrace whatever is the essence of joining the Australian community?
Do we have to have an essence of what it means to be in the Australian community? Why is an essence required? I guess...
Isn't that part of connection?
Does it have to be? Are there other ways to cohere other than that? I feel like there are. Some anti-racist activists in Australia are now going down a strict human rights pathway where we treat each other politely, kindly, because we're all humans and it's what we do. We don't have to have a shared understanding of cricket or anything. We just have to have an agreement that we are polite and helpful and kind. And we don't social cohesion doesn't require a kind of
Aussie, 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 oi, oi, oi.
Yeah, I don't think it requires that. I think that there are other ways to cohere, and I think Australia has this history of wanting to have social cohesion around these kind of racialized lines, but it hasn't been very productive for us, and I don't think it's required.
So the questions are starting to pop up on the screen. You can add extra ones, or you can vote for some of the questions that are already there, and we'll come to that in a few minutes. One of the things that fascinates me the most, and Karen, I'll start with you on this as well, is what's called the gangplank phenomenon, which is very often second and third generation descendants of migrants have very hardcore views about other groups that are arriving. So in the Australian context, you might, and I'm just picking up individual groups of migrants because they're very large numbers. I'm not saying it's typical of them, but for instance, the children or even grandchildren of Italian or Greek migrants who came after World War II, who say, oh, my parents did it tough. The people who come now, they've got it too easy. They're not doing it the way we did. And the gangplank notion is, and so we got here and now let's pull up the gangplank or the drawbridge and say, okay, we shouldn't let more people in. What do we learn from that phenomenon? Karen, I'll start with you.
Well, I don't know I don't know the evidence basis for that, to be honest. I think there's a lot of discourse around that, but I don't know that it's actually such a thing. I think quite a lot of times migrants who've done it tough think, well, hopefully it won't be so hard for you, because it was really bad for us, and I hope that you have a better time. And so it's actually quite the opposite, which is that we'll give you a hand and be helpful, because we know how horrible it was, and we don't want that to happen to you. So I think I challenge your notion that is a common thing amongst second and third generation. I think it probably is for some, but I also don't think that it is a uniform thing, or has to be, or should be. I think. Again,
I wasn't suggesting it's uniform. I'm saying, but it's recognised as a thing.
I think it can be a thing, but I also thinking about I've done quite a lot of research into the discourses of African gangs. There are no African gangs. There are no African gangs. There are literally no African gangs. There are obviously people in the African community who are criminals, just like there are in every single community. They are not organized into gangs. It is. Where was I going to go with that? Because it's about the gangplank thing, but it's about.
You just wanted to get it out.
I did want to get it out, but actually, it is about that. That some people have said to me, well, in the 1980s it was the Vietnamese, and then in the 1990s it was the Asians and the Muslims, and then in the 2000s it was the Africans, and so it just whichever new group is coming, they're the ones that get targeted, and I think that's a really bad way of looking at things. Why should new groups be targeted? And for the Africans, they're still being targeted. When does that stop?
Okay. Joe, we've talked about sport. What about food? We've had endless numbers of very successful food festivals, often based around individual migrant groups, street festivals, food festivals and the like. Is that another way of building bridges, and a very productive way of building bridges between communities where everyone basically has something to celebrate, something to offer, and everyone enjoys eating?
Well, all practical parts of living together are moments of the interaction, and I agree that both sport and food, when I was involved in crafting, actually helping to craft some of the work in multicultural, certainly in education in the late 70s and early 80s, people used to dismiss these things and say, we want really substantial ideological change. We're not interested in these things that's superficial. And of course it can be superficial sometimes, but there are also moments of interaction. I think it's very important for academics not to be kind of judgmental about people's lives. These are moments when ordinary people, in inverted commas, I hate that term, but that's what it is true. A lot of people interact really substantially across and in interactions of this kind, and I do too. All of us do in our own way, and I think yes, these are very important moments, but I think we must not neglect education, and we don't have conscription anymore, but if you think of the public institutions in which people are forced to be together, other than, I can't think of any other one. Education is children are deprived of their liberty at age 5, and they're compulsorily educated. They are forced to go to school, and we have to ask the question, what is it that the society invests in and does during that period of 15 years when it's only criminals who are otherwise deprived of their liberty, and criminals and children. So if we do that to children, we've got to ask the question, what is our justification for doing it? What do we put in there in terms of these big questions of how we live together in Ghassan's very suggestive term, in not only non-humiliating but dignifying ways, that ask really deep questions about being humans together, sharing a polity, sharing a community, communicating in that community, because we can never neglect that it is it's the medium for everything else that happens. Even in cooking shows, people are talking all the time. At sport, they're talking all the time. And people invest so much of their sense of identity in their communicative life. So I think these questions in particular, as far as public education are concerned, and I mean by public education, I don't just mean government schools, I mean
No, but
compulsory education are absolutely important.
But on that theme, increasingly parents are withdrawing their children from government-funded schools where there's a great diversity of the community and choosing a private education where you can actually select either a religious education, so you don't encounter the other, you only meet people who have your view, or if it's not done through faith and religion, it's often done virtually through class, where you will only encounter people from your type of world, your worldview.
Yeah, but all our education systems are required to adhere to national curriculum requirements of different kinds, and of one kind really, which demands teaching about, imposes the requirement on teaching about society in particular kinds of ways. So I don't think that that's an escape clause. I agree with it that you're pointing to a dynamic that's problematical in some ways, but it doesn't obviate the need or remove the need for those schools to have curricula that actually also deal with pluralism, diversity. In Australia, many of them do. If you go to many private schools in Australia, they're extremely diverse in ethnic and cultural and linguistic terms.
That's true too. Look, we're running very much behind time and we'll get to questions, and there's lots of them, but I've got one more for Ghassan. We have the most diverse parliament federally at the moment and at state level. There's more diversity of gender, of ethnicity, of every type imaginable than we've ever had before. Is that not a measurable indication of progress?
Well, I mean, yeah, it is, but it's not a very important one.
Why not?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have lived through women prime ministers who have attacked women's rights. We've lived through coloured prime ministers who had no sympathy to racialized people whatsoever.
Are you talking about the UK or Australia?
I don't think sort of like having some superficial identity. It's a question of what tradition you carry with you when you go to Parliament, not what is your identity. Do you carry a tradition of struggle that you want to implicate, sort of like represent? So yeah, sort of like I don't feel personally, for instance, I know for sure, talking to people that nobody feels, oh wow, it's wonderful, there's a Muslim in Parliament. Nobody would say that. They would say, sort of like, are they really representing the kind of traumatic experiences that we have gone through, and are they living up to those traditions, or are they, because a lot of people, as you said, sort of like politicians are self-interested, etc. Each group says that about the people in Parliament which they are supposed to be sort of like representing. Yes.
So it's not enough, is what you're saying? Mm-hmm. Not enough. Okay. We've got lots of questions, and the question most voted for is Ben's question. Australia's responses to global conflicts often seem inconsistent, writes Ben, not aligned with humanitarian needs, e.g. the response to the Ukraine invasion contrasts with the minimal response to genocides in Tigray and Sudan. What are the implications of such uneven responses for multiculturalism in Australia? Karen.
In 2007, I think it was, Australia stopped taking African refugees because there was a discourse of them not fitting in well here.
Sorry, black African.
Black African refugees from Sudan in particular,
But
not fitting.
white South African farmers, in fact, were fast-tracked.
That's right. People notice these things, and I think it does have implications for our multiculturalism here, and it shows the kinds of people we want to help and the kinds of people we don't want to help. The people who we've imprisoned in our detention centers are different than the Ukrainian refugees who have been fast-tracked. So I think it does have implications for us here.
Okay. Joe or Ghassan, do you want to jump in on that at all? Joe.
Sure, I'm happy to say so.
Sorry, Ghassan first then.
No.
You've started, keep going.
Yes, so, I mean, I don't feel I relate to someone from outside government saying that government foreign policy is inconsistent. Yeah, I mean, I can find many things inconsistent, but according to some intellectual criteria, etc., I don't think sort of like government decide foreign policy on the basis of holding a tutorial in logic and consistency and deciding this is consistent. Sort of like, foreign policy is a negotiated thing between interests and what have you. And I think it's very crucial to realize that the relation between multiculturalism and policy has to do with how you work and oppose a certain foreign policy and work towards a government which is more in agreement with your own and how you do that, but not in terms of jumping at an existing foreign policy and saying, I want to replace it by my people's desires of what they think is consistent. I don't think, obviously, this works like this.
Okay, Joe?
Well, I'd like to see our government be much tougher with the regime in Myanmar, so I'd like them to be less inconsistent than they're being now on that one.
Just Myanmar, or?
Well, I mean...
Well, you have a personal interest in
I'm
it.
trying to make a point that these questions are dictated by our interests and subjective positions on them. I think there are always circumstances in which governments can defend what they do, and I agree that they do appear inconsistent. I argue that too, and I've just given you an example of one.
Gregory Turner asks, is it not true that stifling opinion in protest by Melbourne University inhibits and frays multiculturalism? Open and respectful opinion enhances multiculturalism. Now, none of you are here to speak on behalf of the university administration, nor am I, but Karen, you do have a leadership role here as the chair of the academic board.
Well, I'm here in my own personal researcher role here, and I do think that there is a place for student protest at the university. I strongly support the students' right to protest.
And is there a link, as the question asks, between a commitment to the right to protest and enhancing multiculturalism?
I'm not sure.
I think there is.
I think there might be, but I think having a multiplicity of views is really important, and I actually think that a diversity of opinions is really important for good decision making. So, and I guess it goes back to what Ghassan was saying about, what do you mean by multiculturalism? Which multiculturalism are we talking about? I think in general, a diversity of opinions is a really helpful thing. And I think we should be trying to have as many as we can to get all aspects of whatever it is we're trying to talk about.
And surely within the university community, the more dialogue, the more interaction, the more engagement, the more cross-cultural communication there is, the better for not just the university, but the broader community as well. It's not an unreasonable thing to say.
I think
But
having...
that happens all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
But the implication in the question is...
That is the norm. That is the norm in academic life, to talk respectively, respectfully, and interact. I mean, that's not So when students are engaging in political activism, I think the question is, there's two things. One, is there two groups conflictually engaging in activism? And there you have an issue of multiculturalism, i.e. how do you negotiate two views? But if it is simply one group engaging in expressing themselves politically, it's not an issue of multiculturalism. It's simply a very straightforward political issue of whether the university allows people to express their political opinion and recognize that, you know, politics is a bit like the pleasure principle of academic life. If you don't know how to express it, sometimes people express it in a gauche manner, but people have to learn to express it. And the university should definitely, this is where they learn to express it. And if they express it a little bit excessively and they get repressed, this is bad politics, but it has nothing to do with multiculturalism.
No, and as long as it doesn't spill over into violence, threats of violence, incitement to violence, that's where the university and the community more broadly draws a line, and surely quite rightly.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. Next question. As an alumna of the University of Melbourne, I really do question its commitment to anti-racism and multiculturalism when the university receives funding and collaborates with weapons manufacturers such as Lockheed Martin and Boeing. This seems like a massive inconsistency. I could throw this one back at Karen, but I won't because that would be unfair. Joe, do you think we're inconsistent?
Well, I'm not going to speak on behalf of the university. I think this is confounding a few things that may not be exactly the same. I don't know what to say to it. It seems to me to be a question of, I don't know about that funding and what it does and where it goes, and so I can't answer that question.
Well, the next one, Karen, is directly addressed to you. Karen, can you speak about your role in the Due Diligence Advisory Group, the Research Due Diligence Advisory Group concerning research ethics and multicultural studies? So are efforts to demilitarise the university progressing, given its links to companies like Lockheed Martin and BAE, being seriously addressed? So how, the question's a little all over the place, but is there an inconsistency again?
Between my work and between the university's position,
yeah,
and my role on the Research Due Diligence Advisory Group? I mean, I'm on the Research Due Diligence Advisory Group. It's my role as academic board president, and I sit there as a governance oversight person on that body. I feel like the research portfolio at the university has actually been really transparent about its links with weapons companies. It's all on the website. I think I don't really know how to respond to that. Other than that, I think that they've taken the queries very seriously and have disclosed appropriately. In terms of my in conflict with my own research, I actually don't think it's in conflict at all. Yeah, I guess that's all I can say.
And I can just foreshadow that another event in this series, In Pursuit of Knowledge, we've called them, there is a specific session early next year when the term reconvenes, when students are back and the university's back into full swing, where we will tease that out as a topic in its own right. And I think, to give some credit, when that was proposed as a discussion to have publicly, the approval came immediately from Chancellery. There was no one saying, oh no, that's too awkward, too embarrassing, too dangerous. We can't have that conversation. In fact, it was quite the reverse. It was, yes, let's do that because we have a story we want to tell and we're not afraid of those questions. So foreshadowing, that's, you can book your seats in now, and we'll see if the capacity of the largest lecture theatre in the university is going to be sufficient for the people who want to come along and hear from that one. The next question is from Peter, very specifically asking, To what extent has the conflict in Palestine created fractures in Australian society rather than exposing ones that already existed? Ghassan?
Yeah. I think, there's an old tradition in Australia of always thinking, don't bring the conflict with you. Don't bring your conflict with you. And the idea is that the political tension is original somewhere else, and sort of like you bring it with you or you don't bring it with you. But it seems to me that it has never been the case, but especially so, it is not the case in the case of Palestine, because the conflict is exacerbated by Australian foreign policy. It has an important impact on how it exacerbates. I don't think there is an escape out of this. So it's not that the government is capable of having a policy on Israel-Palestine without exacerbating them, because it has historically a well-known sort of like foreign policy which has a colonial lineage, and it supports a very specific sort of like a colonial geopolitical landscape. And this is so through that process, it exacerbates tension, and some people feel it's on their side. Some people feel it's not on their side. Some people resent it. Some people don't resent it. Some people who should be not resent it sometimes even. And as I repeat, I think it's a very important thing about foreign policy, because I feel people should learn to manage the fact that in a multicultural society, you cannot have a foreign policy that pleases everyone. But it is one thing to be not pleasing someone. It is another to treat them as if I don't care what you think. I don't care the ramifications of my policy on you. That is what happens, it seems to me, definitely in the case of Palestinians. I think, sure, there is, so the Australian government has a policy which is more supportive of, was similar to the American, the UK, etc. Okay, but this kind of infantilizing of everybody and saying, oh no, it is still, no, we are we are really trying to be careful. They're not, they have a biased foreign policy. So they've been voted and they can have it. If you want to change it, try and vote another government. That's fine, I can live with it. But they have to do different kind of politics in terms of how they present it to people, if it has to be multicultural in that sense.
Madison's question is, I'd like to hear the panellists' ideas on the governing of ethnic populations within Australian society through visa infrastructure. Our politicians regularly govern who or who isn't deemed worthy and how worthy they are through visa acceptance, e.g., accepting Ukrainian refugees, but not Palestinian. Joe? We have taken, I might just say in the question, it says not Palestinian. There are lots of Palestinians who have been allowed into Australia.
Yeah, so I don't know what the empirical basis of the question is, so I obviously...
But let's readdress it, if I may. The immigration system is essentially political, isn't it?
Well, there are criteria that are very well established, and when you look at the comparison that other countries make with their immigration systems and Australia's, one of the things that, you might disagree with this, but this is one thing that's regularly said in quite a few other societies, that Australia and Canada have an explicit and publicly available immigration selection system, and this is available according to the visa categories, the numbers that are permitted each year, and that they're modified occasionally by government. It's obviously the case that they can do that. I was actually in Parliament House in 1989 when Bob Hawke made the announcement on the acceptance of all Chinese students who were in Australia at the time of the Tiananmen Square incidents, that they would all be given visas immediately, and that has remained as a kind of demand that subsequent groups have made in relation to that behaviour. So it's obviously possible that that discretion has not changed. So it's clear that one of the implications in the question is correct, that it is a kind of, I don't know if government is the right word about it, governing it, but there's clear that there's a discretionary power which is utilised according to political sentiment at the time that it happens. And unquestionably there is discrimination from time to time. But to say that it's completely like that flies in the face of the fact that it's actually a highly regulated, systematic approach to immigration, which is really, I mean, you should read the OECD reports on comparative immigration systems in the world. You see that Australia counts as probably the most, maybe second to Canada perhaps, well, we're second to Canada, the most explicit and, I wouldn't use this term, but they do, objective one that's available. So it's clearly subject to discretion, and the discretion reflects the political tendencies of the person doing the discretion at any one time. But to say it's completely like that, I think is not correct.
We'll try and get through the next two questions if we can, and then we'll be out of time. Nail Sayum says, how can developed nations tap into the potential of migrants from conflict regions, ensuring they become integral to the cultural and economic fabric of society? I'll insert Australian society. Karen?
There's good research that shows that refugees, because we're talking about refugees here, become really good citizens. Really, they're a great bet for citizenship because they don't have anywhere else to go. And they make a home. They come with a long-term view and they make a home. I think letting them in is a good thing for society. So I think, you know, we have one of the, we have a relatively small intake of refugees. It's a really regulated way people can get in here through our refugee program. Compared to the other migration categories, it's tiny. We could take more.
Joe said before how important language is, and yet we've reduced funding for some of the language programs for new arrivals. Is that a mistake then?
Yeah, probably. I think it's
huge
really
mistake.
important for people to be able to communicate, you know, and helps them get jobs, helps them to make neighbours, and it's really important.
To contribute, to participate.
Yeah, really important.
Yep. So one of the first things we should do is reinvest in language programs?
Well, I don't know if it's the first thing we should do, but I think it's an important thing that we should be doing, is investing in language programs.
I don't need to ask Joe because I'm sure he's going, yeah, he's nodding his head for people who can't see him nodding. Ghassan, do you agree? Do we have unanimity here?
About language? Yes, so but I do have a problem with discussion which is continuously centered on how well certain people function for us. Some kind of idea that we judge people according to are they useful for us or are they not useful for us? You know, I mean, I think this is the road towards discrimination on the point, because the moment they stop being useful for us according to whoever is determining usage, they will say, okay, well, that's not nice. We don't judge every Australian citizen according to how useful they are, and I don't think usefulness should be the central criteria of accepting.
Oh, we do when we vote. We decide whether they're useful or not, I say, by way of sidebar.
I also think just on that, you know, there's this whole idea that people should be grateful, and I think that's also a very problematic thing as well.
And Benji, our final question, how do we build respect and inclusion for the LGBTQI plus individuals within the fabric of Australian multiculturalism when some cultural beliefs may differ? And it's more than differ. They may not in any way share the desire to include. In fact, there's some specific examples. Joe's drawn breath.
Well, I think it's there's a slight implication in the question that the problem resides in the immigrant groups and their attitudes, when in fact, if you look at the distribution of attitudes in relation to LGBTQIA plus communities, that I wouldn't say that they're particularly strongly concentrated. They may be to some extent according to the history of experience of liberal policies in some places. But, you know, the only solution to such a question is the same one as all the others, and that is opportunities for serious engagement with dialogue about the claims that people make on social social legislation on their behalf. And these things, as I've said before, are the subject of localised practices of communication, which within the adult migrant education program are the way in which pedagogy proceeds, the way in which people talk about living in the society. It isn't just classroom teaching, it's about engagement with what the society is, how you influence it, how you participate in it. And this is one of the questions that arises there, and obviously that is one of the ways of building what the questioner is seeking.
Any final words? Karen?
I think I'll just leave it there.
Ghassan?
I'm happy to leave it there.
Extraordinary. We've had three fabulous experts sharing their years of experience, their research, their knowledge, their expertise with us this evening. Could you thank the panel before we hear from Pip Nicholson? And finally, Professor Pip Nicholson, who is the... I'm going to get your title wrong here.
I don't think I really care about my title, John, so...
She's in charge of much of the stuff that happens at the university.
Yeah. So hello everyone, I'm Pip. I too wanted to thank the panel and its mediator, so thank you to all of you. At the first of this series, In the Pursuit of Knowledge, I reflected on the role of civic institutions such as a university and how we must continue the long tradition of sharing knowledge. In fact, perhaps we have an obligation to acquit that we are sharing the knowledge that we are creating, and the importance of doing so when we do not agree. Tonight we continued, I think, that model of conversation, in particular as we explored, I think, the moral and definitional dilemmas of multiculturalism, social cohesion, and all that tests both and their relationship with each other. I think we also heard from the experts the need to acknowledge racism, but also the need to walk towards it and not away from it, and to work with each other as we come to understand it and resist it. There is a need to create an environment in this university, and I think, Ghassan, you mentioned it is in this university, as in so many others, where we can find connection and keep on conversing, both agreeing and disagreeing. And I think we've seen the role that definitions such as multiculturalism, such as those surrounding racism, can play in both limiting and expanding the ability to converse. And I did check, with the benefit of an able assistant, the origins of the meanings of converse, which in Latin means to keep in company with. So embedded in the talking work is the act of staying in each other's company. So it is an entwinement of talking and coming together as a community that I hope we will continue to do well into the future. And at this point, I have to remind you that on the 15th of October, the third in the series will take place, and we will have panellists discussing the election unfolding in the United States of America from two very different perspectives. But I have very much enjoyed the panel's reflections tonight, and I have very much enjoyed the fact that we have been conversing and entwining together, and I thank you, the audience, for being here, and your audience online also. Thank you and good night.